Not to mention the detail that regardless of what happens in this fight between Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier on Saturday night, whatever the future holds for Conor McGregor, he's going to be busy. Like, he is going to be very busy. I mean, he's going to be part of that lightweight title picture almost no matter what. I mean, a win over Poirier puts him in a much better position to chase that title. But he's not going to go away just because he lost to Dustin Poirier. And on top of that, there are other people that are looking at Conor McGregor as somebody that they would like to fight. I mean, in particular, boxing legend Manny Pacquiao has come out and said that he'd like to fight Conor McGregor. He said that, basically in the case of Manny Pacquiao, he's come out and said that he would like to have, quote unquote, he would like to have the experience of boxing with an MMA fighter. Although personally, I think that Chael Sonnen had this about right when he kind of recently observed that really, probably what's at play here is that Manny Pacquiao noticed a certain $50 million offer to Conor McGregor to have a boxing match and said to himself, well, if they're willing to offer him $50 million to fight that guy, then you would think that one of the best boxers of all time, pound for pound, across the board, one of the best boxers of all time against Conor McGregor, would have to do a good deal better than that $50 million. And I would have to say so too. Now, there's obviously a lot of incentive for Conor McGregor to continue to indulge the boxing world. I mean, his fight against Floyd Mayweather treated him very well. He walked away with a $100 million payday for that fight. And so you would have to think to yourself, if he earned $100 million for fighting Floyd Mayweather, the pound-for-pound best boxer of all time, fighting a guy who's arguably maybe the number 2 pound-for-pound of all time in Manny Pacquiao, well, that might not quite get him to another $100 million, but it could get him to maybe $75, $80 million. I mean, the one thing that couldn't be said about Manny Pacquiao is really nobody would say that Manny Pacquiao is himself on his own a great fight promoter. Manny Pacquiao, he invests all of his energies into the training and the competition side of boxing. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's treated him very well. But one of the reasons why the McGregor versus Mayweather fight did what it did was because you had two guys that basically they were very good promoting partners. They both pulled their weight in terms of saying and doing things that made people want to see that fight. And really, when you have a fight on the when you're offering a fight like Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather, really you don't really have to do all that much. Now, arguably, perhaps the same thing should be said about a fight between Conor McGregor and Manny Pacquiao. Those are two guys that, quite frankly, it shouldn't take much more than either just what's on the paper to get people to buy it. But then again, one thing that you have to remember is that really professional fighting is more about just the fighting. It's about the storytelling. And sometimes even the stories best told in the ring do require a very good prologue to get people to really buy into it. And as it pertained to the Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather fight, yes, the prologue was a very important part of what got people to come and buy that, the body of that story. Now, as it pertains to McGregor versus Pacquiao, it's true that Manny Pacquiao probably wouldn't be what you would call an ideal partner in terms of building that prologue. But there's already a very compelling epilogue to that story already on the table, and that is it comes in the form of Mauricio Sulaiman. So Mauricio Sulaiman, he's the president of the IBC, and he's recently come out and said that Conor McGregor is just one fight away from a championship match. Not necessarily one win away from a championship match, but just one fight away from a championship match. And yes, you would have to think that in a properly competitive sport, that one fight should end in a win in order to qualify for a championship match. Although boxing isn't really what you would call a healthy competitive sport. But when you're fighting an absolute legend like Manny Pacquiao, that is one scenario where a loss does have some value to it. Definitely not as much value as a win, but it is valuable in some extent. I mean, at the very least, Conor McGregor, he could go on to fight for a championship, and yeah, they could walk him into the ring having not won any professional fights. But his only 2 professional fights were against arguably the number 1 and number 2 pound for pound all time in the entirety of that sport. A championship match is definitely not off the table under those circumstances, especially not in a sport like boxing, where, as I mentioned before, the competitive architecture is not exactly strong. Now, you would think that featuring such a pivotal Now you would think that featuring as such a central figure in the lightweight championship picture would be enough disincentive for Conor McGregor to not go off and chase after a boxing career. But at the same time, you do also have to keep in mind that, I mean, we're talking about, in Conor McGregor, you're talking about a guy who walked away from not one, but 2 UFC championships just to go off and fight in a non-title match. And he made a buttload of money doing it. And so you would have to think to yourself, if there's not only just another buttload of money out there pretty much sitting right there for him to go get in that kind of a situation, and not just that, but another championship right around the corner from that buttload of money, a guy as mercurial as Conor McGregor, I think the one thing that we know about him, the one thing that we know about Conor McGregor more than anything else is that you don't really know what Conor McGregor is actually going to do. You know, he can and will do absolutely anything, and as soon as you think that he's not going to do something, well, that's the time when you're in for a big surprise with a guy like Conor McGregor. So this is actually something that I consider to be well within the realm of possibility. Now, in my personal opinion, the wildest thing about this entire scenario is actually, when you think about it, just how little it would actually hurt the UFC if Conor McGregor was to go off and do something like this. You know, right now, the lightweight division is not only probably the best that it's ever been, but arguably the lightweight division right now might be more star-studded than almost any division that the UFC has ever had in its history. I mean, even if you take out Khabib and Conor out of that picture, and you still look at the stars of that division, and it is just, it's breathtaking. It's breathtaking the amount of star power that would still be in that division if Conor McGregor were to split and go make a bid for a boxing championship. You would still have Justin Gaethje. You would still have Tony Ferguson, I mean, depending on what happens with Tony's health. You'd still have Charles Oliveira. You'd still have Michael Chandler, Dan Hooker. Nate Diaz is moving down to lightweight. And if Dana White could actually manage to turn this into an opportunity to finally fully launch Zuffa Boxing, well, probably it's entirely possible that even Dana White might not have a big issue with this. But to me personally, what's actually the most compelling about this whole situation is, unfortunately, this whole Jake Paul factor. And I had never thought that Jake Paul would actually factor into something in a serious sense, but in this case he actually does. So I'm sure that a lot of people are aware that his brother Logan Paul is set to fight Floyd Mayweather this year, actually within the next couple of months. Not really what I would consider to be a very interesting fight, but you know, the one thing that I will say about Logan Paul, I mean, I don't like the guy very much, but at the very least, he's going about this Floyd Mayweather fight the right way. He's going about it the right way. He's treating Floyd Mayweather with the right amount of respect. It wasn't what I was expecting to see out of Logan Paul, but you know, I'm quite happy to be surprised by this. And so one thing that Jake Paul came out and said recently was he said that his brother is, quote unquote, you know, hurting boxing, you know, by taking this fight up against Mayweather. Because apparently maybe what he really ought to be doing is, you know, is fighting other YouTubers and retirees. You know, retirees who were never even really boxers. Yeah, it was a very peculiar thing, and and to me the whole thing just underscores a very negative attitude that Jake Paul has about boxing in general. But imagine this kind of scenario. So Conor McGregor, the guy that won't give Jake Paul the time of day, takes a fight against Manny Pacquiao, one of the #1 rivals of the guy that his brother's going to fight, that Jake Paul says is, quote unquote, bad for boxing. And then win, lose, or draw, after that fight, he goes on to fight for a real championship. You know, like a real championship, not that not that participation trophy that Jake Paul got for participating in the Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. card. You know, not that fake championship that Suleiman gave to Jake Paul that he actually had the word amateur taken off of. But the guy who won't even give Jake Paul the time of day goes on, makes more money than he would have made to fight Jake Paul, and goes on to win a championship, all while Jake Paul has to settle for fighting in these boxing mud shows. To me, that's a very appealing scenario. And personally, I think that a McGregor versus Pacquiao fight would be worth it just for that alone.